The fork was still halfway to my mouth when she said it. "Give me the money and stop being a leech." It was louder than necessary. Louder than the clinking of glasses, louder than the shallow laughter that had filled the room just moments earlier. The kind of loud that was meant to cut, to shame, to make sure everyone heard. My brother froze mid-chew. My cousin stopped pouring wine. Even the youngest niece looked up from her phone. All eyes were on me. I set my fork down gently. My napkin still folded untouched on my lap. Then I did something no one expected. I laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a hysterical one. It was low, steady. Almost tired. Across the table, Loretta's face pinched with confusion. Then irritation. She leaned forward like she hadn't just detonated a bomb. "I mean it, Rhea," she snapped. "It's about time you grew up and stopped depending on other people. Your father would be ashamed if he saw what you've become." That part made me pause. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. I stood up, smoothing my dress at the hip. The room was silent. "No," I said calmly, looking straight at her. "He'd be ashamed of you." She blinked. I reached into my bag, pulled out the thick white envelope I'd been carrying for months. I walked it to the center of the table and placed it between the butter dish and the salt shaker. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling now. "A reminder," I said, "that you've been living in a house you don't own, paid for by the daughter you just called a leech." And then, with all the grace she never gave me, I turned to leave. After my father died, the first thing my mother said wasn't about the funeral or the house or even her grief. It was, "What am I supposed to do now?" I knew what she meant, not emotionally, financially. Within 2 weeks, she'd moved into my guest bedroom with 3 suitcases and a box labeled important papers that was mostly old tax documents and unopened bills. She never asked if she could stay. She just arrived. I paid for everything quietly, the utilities, the groceries, her credit card minimums. I covered the balance when her car needed new tires and again when she overdrew her checking account for the 5th time that year. I even made her cell phone bill part of my auto-pay just so she wouldn't have to feel the shame of being cut off. Except she never felt shame. Not once. At family gatherings, she'd brag about how she keeps the lights on and how I was lucky she didn't charge rent. When my uncle once joked that I owed her room service, she laughed and said she eats like a queen and I foot the bill. Everyone nodded. Everyone smiled. I said nothing. Letting her have the credit made things easier. It kept the peace. I told myself that was worth something, but I started noticing the quiet ways she rewrote the story. It was no longer that I let her move in, it was that she rescued me, that she was the one carrying the household, that I was a burden she graciously tolerated, and every time I swallowed it, I made it true. I kept the receipts, the bank statements, the transfer logs. I kept them not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew eventually I'd need to remember I wasn't crazy. And the moment I needed them finally came on the night she called me a leech. The signs were always there. Small, sharp things I convinced myself weren't worth bleeding over. She called me selfish the first time I said no to a vacation she wanted, one I would have had to finance. "You're lucky I don't charge you for all the things I've done," she added, tossing the catalog onto the kitchen counter like a challenge. When I wore a blazer from Goodwill to a cousin's wedding, she pulled me aside before we walked in and hissed, "Don't embarrass me tonight." I smiled and adjusted the sleeves, knowing the tags were cut off, but the judgment wasn't. She'd whisper to relatives when she thought I was out of earshot. She means well, but honestly, she wouldn't survive without me. Then she'd say it louder, just enough for me to hear. Some people just never grow up. At first, I laughed it off. Then I minimized. Then I swallowed. A friend of mine once came over while Mom was mid-rant about how I'd forgotten her medication refill, even though it was sitting in a paper bag on the counter. After she left the room, my friend asked, "Why do you let her speak to you like that?" I didn't answer. I didn't have one. Because I loved her, because she was my mother, because no one ever taught me that love doesn't mean allowing slow erosion. I stopped inviting people over after that. It was easier to pretend I was choosing solitude than to explain I was enduring something. But love, real love, doesn't make you smaller to fit someone else's pride. And somewhere deep down, I knew she didn't want a daughter. She wanted a dependent with no memory of where the help came from. It was a Tuesday morning when I signed the papers. The realtor handed me the folder with a polite smile, oblivious to the quiet war it represented. I nodded, thanked her, and slid the documents into my bag. The ink wasn't even dry, but the decision had been made long before. I'd opened a holding company 6 months prior, nothing flashy, just enough of a buffer to keep Loretta from snooping. She didn't know how to read property records, but she asked questions when names were too familiar. So the company bore the name of a long-gone great-aunt and a string of initials that meant nothing to her. She believed with certainty that the house we lived in was leased from a family friend who'd been generous to Rhea. She liked to tell people she negotiated the rent, that her social graces kept us sheltered, that the trust fund my father left me was what paid the bills. There was no trust fund. There was just me. And now there was a deed with my name on it. Mine, not hers. Not ours. Not temporary. I bought the house because I was tired of being reminded it wasn't mine. Every time she told someone I was lucky she'd helped me land on my feet. Every time she slammed a door and muttered, "My roof, my rules." Every time she threatened to leave and said, "You wouldn't last a week without me." I bought the house because I knew someday I would need proof. The mortgage came out of an account she didn't know about. The taxes, the insurance, all routed through the company. I kept the original documents in a safe deposit box. I carried copies in my bag. I didn't plan on using them that night at dinner, but I never left home without them. I told her I'd been let go from my consulting firm. No drama, just budget cuts, I said. Downsizing. It happens. She didn't ask for details. She only asked, "So, what does that mean for me?" I shrugged. "We'll have to be more careful for a while." That week, I started swapping brands. No more fancy coffee, no more fresh-cut flowers in the foyer. The Amazon deliveries slowed to a halt. I wore the same 3 sweaters on rotation thrift store finds, soft and faded. I stopped getting my hair done. Let the grays peek through. Loretta noticed. She started sighing louder when the Wi-Fi cut out. Made backhanded comments about what this place used to be like before it got so sad. She canceled her yoga membership on my card and told her friends I was in a rough patch. What she didn't know was that business had never been better. My firm had quietly expanded. I had investments earning more each month than most people made in a year, but I wanted to see what she'd do when there was nothing left to extract. It didn't take long. She began calling me useless when she thought I couldn't hear. Told my cousin at a birthday party that I was draining her spirit. I heard her on the phone with an aunt one night. She sits around all day pretending to be busy. It's pathetic. I was folding laundry at the time, clothes I'd bought with my own money for both of us. That night, I took the wine out of the shared fridge and moved it to a small cooler in my closet. I wanted to see what she'd say when I stopped pouring into her cup. Turns out she started biting the hand that had been feeding her all along. The invitation came on a Monday. Loretta told me we'd be hosting dinner for the family that Friday. Nothing fancy, she said, just a little get-together. It's been too long. I didn't ask why she suddenly wanted to play hostess. I already knew. By Friday evening, the table was dressed like a showroom, linen napkins, crystal glasses, candles that hadn't been lit in years. Loretta wore one of her expensive blouses, the kind she said she only saved for when she needed to be seen. I made the garlic bread. She added too much salt to the roast. We didn't speak much in the kitchen. Family arrived in waves. My cousin Jonah with his wife. Aunt Clara with her usual too loud laugh. My brother Jackson, who hadn't visited in months, brought a bottle of wine that Loretta sniffed at before saying, "Thank you." We all sat, passed dishes, exchanged pleasantries. For a while, it was civil, almost warm. Loretta floated from end to end of the table, smiling too wide, laughing too loudly. Then she stood up and tapped her glass. "I just want to say something," she said, her voice sharp beneath the sugar. "This woman," she pointed toward me, "has been living off me for far too long." Silence. I raised her. I gave her everything, and now she can't even hold down a job. She hides behind her little laptop all day and expects me to cover the bills, to keep the lights on, to clean up her messes. No one moved. No one interrupted. "She owes me," Loretta hissed, voice rising. "And I'm sick of it." Her hand slammed the table. "Give me the money and stop being a leech." The words cracked across the room. My hand tightened around my napkin. I looked around at their faces, confused, embarrassed, entertained, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was the moment I'd been waiting for. I laughed. It came out sharp and sudden like a breath I didn't know I'd been holding for years. I laughed because it was absurd, because it was pathetic, because it was over. Loretta's eyes narrowed. "What's so funny?" I stood, pulled the envelope from my bag, the one I'd carried for months, the one with copies of the deed mortgage payments, bank transfers. I laid it gently in front of her plate, right beside the mashed potatoes. "You want money?" I asked, calm now. "You've already had hundreds of thousands. You just never noticed." I looked around the table. Let's clear a few things up. Everyone was still. Forks, suspended wine glasses, forgotten midair. "I'm not unemployed. I own a consulting firm that grossed nearly $1.8 million last year. I downsized on purpose. I dressed like this on purpose." I let her think I was struggling to see what she'd do. Loretta looked like she might choke on her own breath. "I own this house," I continued. "Bought it 2 years ago through a holding company. Every inch, every wall, every dish in that cupboard mine." I met her eyes. "And since you've made it clear I'm nothing more than a leech to you, I think it's time we end this arrangement." She opened the envelope with shaking hands. The room was so quiet I could hear the paper rip. "Those are your 30-day eviction papers," I said, "already notarized." I turned to the rest of the table. "For those of you wondering what just happened, you've been watching a woman insult her landlord at her own eviction dinner." And with that, I picked up my coat from the back of my chair and walked out, leaving the silence to settle behind me like ash. By morning, the damage had already begun. Loretta moved fast. I imagine she started calling people before the dinner plates were even cleared. By sunrise, my phone buzzed with texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. "What's going on?" "Your mom is saying you snapped she's devastated Rhea." I didn't reply. By noon, Aunt Margie left me a voicemail laced with tears and judgment. "I don't know what's gotten into you. Kicking your own mother out of her home. You need help." By afternoon, my cousin Leah had reposted a vague status on Facebook. "Sometimes the people you raise turn out to be monsters. Prayers for strength." I scrolled past it. She told them I was unstable, that I had fabricated the deed, that I'd manipulated her for years and waited until she was vulnerable to strike. She claimed I threw her out with no notice, no reason, no mercy. She was rewriting history before the ink had even dried. I could have countered it all, sent PDFs of legal documents, proof of payments, time-stamped emails. I could have posted a public statement named names, laid it bare. But I didn't. Instead, I sat by my window with a cup of coffee and watched the trees bend in the early autumn wind. I thought about how much time I'd spent trying to be seen as good, respectful, kind, and how none of it had protected me. Let them talk. Let them decide who they think I am, based on a woman who never once thanked me for the roof over her head. Let the story spread like a spark in dry grass. Because I knew something Loretta didn't. Fires built on lies always burn themselves out when there's no fuel left to feed them. And I had finally stopped supplying the oxygen. Jackson called the next evening. I stared at his name flashing on the screen for 3 full rings before answering. We hadn't spoken outside of holidays in over a year. He didn't waste time. "I heard what happened," he said. "She's saying you've lost it, that you're dangerous." I waited for the accusation, for him to pick a side. "She did the same thing to me," he said instead. 2 years ago when I stopped sending money." I closed my eyes. "She told everyone I was cutting her off out of spite, that I was letting her drown. Never mentioned the tuition I paid for Mia or the medical bills I covered after her surgery. She just flipped the story." I leaned against the wall, letting his voice fill the quiet. "I didn't say anything back then. I didn't want the drama. But now, if you need me to confirm anything to talk to anyone, I will." The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was heavy. Long overdue. "Thanks," I said. "I might take you up on that." "I should have stepped in sooner," he added. "I saw the way she talked to you. But I figured—" "You had it handled?" "I did," I said, "until I didn't." He sighed. "Well, I'm here now." It wasn't everything, but it was something. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was holding the whole story alone. After we hung up, I sat in the dark a while longer, letting the quiet settle. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the legal documents again this time, not with hesitation, but with purpose. She filed the claim 2 weeks later. Elder abuse, the paperwork said. Unlawful eviction. Coercion. I read it twice slowly, letting each word sit like a stone on my chest. Then I forwarded it to my attorney. She's going to lose, he told me. This is smoke, not fire. Still, the hearing was scheduled. I showed up with a file box of proof bank statements, signed agreements, the deed tax records, even the lease Loretta had signed years ago that acknowledged she was living in my home as a guest. She arrived in Pearl's tears already shining, told the judge I manipulated her, said she'd been emotionally mistreated, said she was thrown out with nothing but a suitcase. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish. Then I stood and handed the judge a binder. Organized, labeled, time-stamped. There were copies of every payment I made on her behalf. Utility bills in my name, her car repairs, her medication, screenshots of her texts asking for money, voicemails where she thanked me when she still remembered how. I included the email she once sent to my accountant asking for another wire transfer since Raya owes me for raising her. The judge flipped through each page slower than I wanted, steadier than she expected. Then he looked at her. You've provided no evidence of financial abuse, he said. No evidence of coercion. No proof that your daughter acted unlawfully in removing you from a home that she not only owns, but has paid for documented in detail. She started to object. He raised a hand. This case is dismissed. Immediately. Loretta's mouth opened, but no sound came. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply turned to my attorney. Let's proceed with the restraining order. He nodded. And in that moment, without shouting, without fury, I watched justice arrive, quiet, undeniable, final. The new place wasn't bigger, it wasn't flashier, but it was mine in a way the last one never truly had been. No lingering footsteps down the hallway that didn't belong to me. No second toothbrush on the bathroom counter. No passive-aggressive sticky notes on the fridge. Just quiet. Just space. I didn't decorate all at once. I unpacked slowly, choosing where things went, not based on obligation or shared preference, but instinct. I threw out the old towels, bought new ones in the exact shade of blue I liked. The first night I slept with the window open and the door unlocked, not because I forgot, but because I wasn't afraid. There was no triumph in it, no victory parade, just the quiet satisfaction of air that didn't feel borrowed. A few days in, I saw one of my neighbors watering her plants out front. She looked up, smiled, and waved. I hesitated, then raised my hand and waved back. It was small. Almost nothing. But it felt like a start. I no longer had to carry proof of who I was in a manila folder, no longer had to defend or justify or shrink to make someone else feel taller. The silence in my home was no longer tense. It was earned. And in that stillness, for the first time in years, I began to hear my own voice again, clear, steady, and entirely my own. The building was modest. A converted library just off Main Street with creaky floors and windows that let in too much light. But the chairs were full and the coffee was strong and no one looked at me like I owed them something. I walked to the front of the room, notes in hand. People glanced up, some curious, others cautious. I recognized the expression. I'd worn it myself once. The sign behind me read, "The Calder Foundation, for those who chose peace over pleasing." It had started as a whisper of an idea scribbled in the margins of court filings and grocery lists. A place for people like me, people who loved deeply and lost quietly, people told they were ungrateful for choosing distance, selfish for choosing peace. I took a breath, set my notes down, let the silence hold a little longer than felt comfortable. Then I said, I'm not here to be liked anymore. I'm here to be whole. No one clapped, no one interrupted, they just nodded. One by one they began to speak. Stories different from mine, but lined with the same quiet ache, the same relief, the same slow rebuilding. And as I listened, I realized something I hadn't come to teach. I'd come to witness. There were so many versions of healing. Mine wasn't louder than theirs, just newer, still forming. And in that shared room, I felt it something settling, something lifting, something beginning.